Hey there, and welcome to a deep dive into contract law.
Yeah,
We're going to get into some really interesting stuff about, what makes a contract legit or not legit.
absolutely.
Have you ever heard the phrase voidable contract?
It does have a certain ring to it.
Right.
Yeah.
It's like it just sounds intimidating,
Mm-hmm.
but all it really means is that one of the parties to a contract can legally just say, Nope, I'm out of here,"
That's right.
because of how it went down.
Yep.
And that's what we're looking at today.
Yeah.
We're going to dive into duress and undue influence.
Right.
So think of those times when maybe you felt pressured or even like a little bit threatened to sign something.
Right.
Like, let's say you're in a band, you've been working really hard on your music,
Sure.
and you've finally gotten that record deal, but then you look at the contract and it's not exactly what you hoped for.
Yeah, this is where understanding duress is really important. So imagine the record company says, sign this today or we walk, and we'll make sure no one in the industry ever works with you again.
Ouch.
Yeah.
That's rough.
That's a classic example of duress.
Yeah.
It's not just about feeling stressed or whatever. It's about a wrongful threat being the direct reason that you signed.
Yeah.
The threat has to be the material cause.
Right.
So it had to be like the thing that made you sign it.
So it's like holding your dreams hostage and you're forced to sign this thing
Exactly.
just to prevent total career implosion.
Precisely. And the law recognizes that that kind of pressure can make a contract like totally bogus.
Wow, that's a relief.
Yeah.
So it's not just about feeling pressure, it has to be an actual threat.
Right. And an actual wrongful threat.
Okay, so let's up the stakes a little bit.
Yeah.
What about threats to someone's safety?
Right. So that's where we get into physical duress.
Okay.
And that's obviously a lot more serious.
Yeah.
We're talking threats that are so serious that any reasonable person would be like, yeah, I'm going to sign that.
Yeah.
Like threats to your life, threats of being seriously hurt, even being thrown in jail.
Wow.
And there are real life cases that show just how serious this can be.
Yeah.
There's this case, Rubenstein v. Rubenstein from back in 1956. And basically you had a husband who was so terrified for his safety that he transferred a bunch of his property to his wife.
Wow.
And the court really focused on what was going on in his head.
Right.
They said the fear had to be so strong that it totally shut down his ability to make a free choice.
So it's not just about the words, it's about how those words made him feel.
Exactly. It's about whether the pressure was so intense that it basically shut off their free will.
Right, it makes sense.
Hmm.
But what about situations that are maybe a little less about physical safety and more about finances?
Mm-hmm.
Like a business deal that's gone wrong.
Right. That's where economic duress comes in, and it's
Yes.
super relevant in business.
Yeah.
So picture this. You're a small business owner, and you need this specific part to finish this huge order for a client.
Okay.
Your deadline is coming up fast,
Yeah.
and there's only one supplier who has this part.
Yeah, I can feel the pressure.
Right.
You've got a tight deadline and it's a big client.
Exactly. And the supplier knows how desperate you are, and they use that to their advantage. They jack up the price sky high knowing that you're stuck.
That feels wrong.
Yeah, it can be brutal.
Yeah.
And legally, it might actually be economic duress.
Really?
There's this case, Austin Instrument v. Laurel Corp.
Okay.
This was back in 1971, and Laurel really needed these specialized parts for a government contract.
Okay.
And their supplier, Austin, was like, perfect.
Oh.
They saw this as their chance to force Laurel into this awful deal.
Wow.
And the court really honed in on two questions.
Okay.
First, was the threat actually wrong?
Right.
And second, did it actually harm Laurel?
So it can't just feel wrong.
Right. It has to actually be harmful.
That has to have a negative impact.
Yes, like sign this or your business is toast.
Right. Okay.
It goes way beyond just driving a hard bargain.
Got
It
it.
crosses the line.
Okay, this is making sense, but I can see how this could be really complicated.
It is. And there's another layer that's even more nuanced.
Oh.
Undue influence.
Okay, undue influence. So that sounds a little less threatening.
Mhm.
A little less like
Yeah.
in your face. It's
Yeah.
a little more like, I don't know, a manipulative friend or something.
That's a great way to put it. It's not about threats like in duress.
Right.
It's about subtle pressure that comes from a power imbalance,
Okay.
like between family members, caregivers, or even like a trusted advisor.
So it's someone abusing their position to kind of get their way.
Exactly.
Yeah.
The weaker party can't really make a free and independent decision because of that influence.
That reminds me of this story I heard about an elderly woman who was convinced to sign over her life savings to her caretaker.
Oh, wow.
And it turns out the caretaker had been taking advantage of her for months.
That's a really sad example of how undue influence can play out.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, it happens way too often.
So, in those situations where there's already like an imbalance of power,
Mhm.
what are some warning signs to look out for?
One big red flag is if there's a sense of urgency or if things are being kept secret. Like if someone's being pressured to sign something quickly without having time to think or talk to someone else,
Right.
that can mean something's wrong.
Yeah.
Another red flag is if the agreement is way one-sided,
Okay.
especially if it favors the person who's in the position of power.
So it's like that feeling you get in your gut when
Exactly. Yeah.
something feels off.
Your instincts are often picking up on that power imbalance, even if you can't put your finger on it.
That's interesting.
Yeah.
So this is giving me a lot to think about in terms of contracts and power dynamics.
hmm
But how do courts decide if it's actually undue influence? Because it seems really hard to prove.
You're telling me it can be really tricky.
Right.
Courts look at a bunch of different factors, like was there a relationship of trust and confidence where one person could easily influence the other?
Okay.
Was the weaker party isolated or especially vulnerable?
Okay.
Did they have a chance to talk to a lawyer?
So you're really painting a picture of the entire situation for the court
Ex-
and trying to show how that power imbalance led to an unfair outcome.
right.
Okay, so let's move this over to the business world now.
Sure.
We've talked about economic duress, but what about undue influence with corporations?
That's a great point.
Mm-hmm.
It happens a lot more than you think.
Really?
Oh, yeah.
Okay, let's hear it.
Okay, so picture a startup founder who really needs a big investment to keep their company going.
Okay, the stakes are already high.
Right.
Startups need that money.
Exactly. And let's say this investor knows that.
Oh.
And they use their position to pressure the founder into accepting terms that aren't really fair.
So they're not like threatening the founder's safety,
Right.
but they're using the fact that the company really needs this money.
Exactly. It's a more subtle kind of pressure,
Wow.
using their financial power to influence the decision.
It makes you wonder about all those stories you hear about high-pressure deals. It's like there's this whole other level of strategy going on.
And that's why understanding duress and undue influence is so important. It gives you the tools to analyze what's happening,
Right.
whether it's in your personal life or in a business deal,
Okay.
and to recognize when things just aren't right.
It's like you're giving me X-ray vision for power dynamics or something.
I love it.
But let's get back to the legal side of things.
Sure.
How do courts actually decide if there was undue influence involved?
Yeah, you're right. It's tricky.
It seems really hard to prove.
It can be.
Yeah.
Courts will look at a lot of things.
Okay.
Was there a relationship there where one person had a lot of influence over the other?
Right, like a family member or a mentor.
Exactly. Or was the weaker party kind of isolated
Okay.
or especially vulnerable at the time?
Right.
Did they get legal advice from someone else?
So you're trying to show the court the whole picture
Exactly.
so they understand how the power imbalance led to a bad outcome.
That's it.
Okay, so we've talked about economic duress in the business world,
hmm
but what about undue influence?
Oh, yeah. Undue influence happens in business all the time.
Real,
All the time.
like what kind of situation?
Imagine you've got a startup founder and they really need a big investor to like keep your company afloat.
Okay, yeah, startups need that funding to survive.
Totally. And
Yeah.
what if that investor uses that to their advantage?
Uh-huh.
To push the founder into accepting terms that aren't in their best interest.
So it's not a direct threat or anything.
Right.
That they're kind of exploiting the situation.
Yeah, exactly. They're using their financial power to influence the decision.
Wow, that's kind of shady.
It is, and it happens more than you'd think.
I bet. So it's like this whole hidden layer of pressure in the business world.
And that's exactly why it's so important to understand these concepts like duress and undue influence.
It's like you're giving everyone a crash course in navigating those power dynamics.
Exactly, because once you understand them, you can start to spot them in your own life.
Okay, so let's bring it all home. Now we've covered a lot of ground today.
We have.
From rock stars to startups.
Mm-hmm.
What are the key things you want our listeners to take away from this deep dive?
Well, the biggest thing is to remember that a contract should be a genuine agreement between people.
Right, it should be fair.
Yes.
Yeah.
And duress and undue influence, they mess with that.
They throw the whole thing off balance.
Exactly. They bring in this element of force or manipulation.
So it's not just about what's written down on paper, it's about the whole situation.
Absolutely. And the second thing is, I want our listeners to feel empowered.
I like that.
If something feels off about a deal or even just an interaction,
You should listen to that feeling.
yes, trust your gut. Don't be afraid to ask questions or walk away if you need to.
Because if it seems too good to be true, it probably is.
Or in this case, if it feels wrong, It probably is.
Exactly. And knowing about these legal concepts can really help people protect themselves.
For sure. Knowledge is power.
I love this deep dive. I feel like I have a much better understanding of duress and undue influence now,
I'm glad to hear that.
and how they can actually play out in real life.
Yeah, and remember, this is just the beginning.
Right.
There's so much more to learn about contract law.
It's fascinating stuff.
It is, so keep that curiosity alive.
Absolutely. And for our listeners out there, we hope this deep dive has given you some new insights
Yeah.
and the tools to confidently navigate those tricky situations where someone might be trying to pressure you.
Exactly.
Until next time, keep exploring and keep those contracts clean.